If you're new to this channel, you may consider subscribing and hit the bell icon so that you continue to receive the updates. Please share it with all others who might benefit. Let's get started.
In this video, we're going to talk about hypothesis testing. Essentially, this video would introduce a lot of new terms that will make the entire journey of learning hypothesis testing very easy for you. So let's get started. What is a hypothesis and how is it relevant for us? So in general, when we are trying to describe an outcome, we may have a number of variables that we can hold accountable for that outcome. A guess, or based on the past experience that people are able to hold certain factors responsible for an outcome. For example, let's say we are talking about why people leave an organization. The top of the mind recall could be that maybe people are not happy with the compensation, maybe there is less work-life balance, maybe people are getting better opportunities in the market, maybe the company does not support a lot of learning and growth, or maybe it's just the interaction with the immediate manager. Any of these factors could lead to an employee leaving an organization. But this is all theoretical. This is something that we are able to believe based on our experience. For a given company, for the employees who are leading the organization, there may be a sound reason for that. And maybe not all 5 options that we have listed here hold good. So we have to filter these to an extent where we are able to say that yes, for a particular organization, why people leave is because of these 3 reasons. This entire process of filtering from the potential list of factors that could be responsible for an outcome to the critical list of factors that are responsible for an outcome is hypothesis testing. It's a step-by-step process, more or less uniformly described in books and tutorials. Let's look at the step-by-step process. So we begin by selecting a test based on the data type and conditions. Then we state a null and alternate hypotheses. Then we determine the level of significance. Then we compute a test statistic or a p-value. And finally, we conclude the hypothesis result. So throughout the journey of hypothesis testing, we will be following this step-by-step process. Now, let's begin by understanding what is a hypothesis and what are these null and alternate hypotheses statements. So first of all, hypothesis in simple terms is just an assumption. Why we are talking about something being considered as an assumption? Because the scenarios keep on changing. The world is dynamic and our assumptions that hold good at a certain point in time may not continue to hold true forever. So we may want to check if our assumption is actually something that can be validated with the help of data. When we test the assumptions, we have 2 possibilities. Number 1, the assumption continues to hold good. And the second possibility is that we have reasons to believe that the assumption doesn't hold good anymore. So the null hypothesis, as denoted by H0, is the prevalent belief. It's assumed to be true unless there is evidence against it. It's also called the status quo, the prevalent belief, and it's assumed to be true. Now, the second possibility is the alternate hypothesis, which is represented as H1 or H sub A. It's a claim against the assumption. So it's an assertion. It's essentially challenging the status quo. It's saying, no, we have reasons to believe that there is a deviation. Let's understand this with the help of some examples. The most famous example that's covered while teaching hypothesis testing is that of a judicial trial. So what's the null hypothesis? The null hypothesis in case of a judicial trial is the presumption of innocence. It is said that we will assume the person to be innocent until proven guilty. That's your null hypothesis. In a way, we can say that's the majority scenario. In any country or any system, majority of the people are not criminal. So we can't assume that the person is guilty by default. The majority of the prevalent belief is that their person is innocent unless there is evidence to prove otherwise. And who brings the evidence? So prosecution brings the evidence. Prosecution claims that the person is guilty. That's your alternate hypothesis. So in a given scenario, there would always be a prevalent belief. That will be our null hypothesis. But if for some reason that prevalent belief does not hold good and we have evidence to prove that it doesn't hold good, we bring the alternate hypothesis that challenges the prevalent belief. Let's take another example. Let's say we are testing a person for a disease. Let's say for cancer. Now, majority of the people in a country would not be positive for a disease. There would be a small proportion of the population that will be suffering from a disease. So what the majority scenario or the null hypothesis or the prevalent belief? The prevalent belief would be that the person is healthy. But if the blood cell count suggests so, that the person seriously seemed to have an issue. But in the event that this patient gets a test done and the test suggests so that the person has cancer, we'll have to believe that. So the outcome of the test, if it suggests otherwise, it's the alternate hypothesis. So the null hypothesis would be that the person is healthy. Alternate hypothesis would be that the person is suffering from a disease or cancer in this case. Let's take another example. When somebody goes to a bank to, let's say, borrow some money, what should be the null hypothesis? The null hypothesis in this case should be that the person is credit worthy. Why? Because banks lend money to a lot of people and majority of the people don't default. Had they been defaulting, the banks would no longer lend money. So creditworthiness wise, by default, we'll assume that the person is worthy. But you'd want to check the credit history. You would want to check the data. And if you find this person has of late been defaulting or has some troubles in maintaining a good credit score, then you have the evidence or reasons to believe that the person is not creditworthy. To begin with, you believe the majority, which is that the person is worthy. But if the data suggests so, of course, you have the evidence to believe that the person is not worthy of good credit. With that, let's move back to the judicial trial scenario and extend that example a little further. So let's talk about the judgment. Of course, there would be a reality whether the person is guilty or non-guilty. And there can also be a judgment that says guilty or not guilty. When the judgment is in sync with the reality, that is, when guilty is being called guilty or not guilty is being called not guilty, we don't have a problem. We have this green box. But wherever the judgment is not in sync with the reality, then we have a problem. These red boxes indicate such scenarios. So the first box here suggests that the person in reality is not guilty, but the judgment declared that person to be guilty. And this box suggests that the person in reality is guilty, but the judgment could not declare this person guilty. These two are errors. Now, the first one here is called the type 1 error. It's represented by a Greek symbol alpha. And this is a case when we incorrectly reject the null hypothesis. So to understand the type 1 error, we first need to know what is the null hypothesis. Null hypothesis was that the person is not guilty. We incorrectly rejected it. Judgment said the person is guilty. That's a type 1 error. And the second box here is the type 2 error, which is incorrectly not rejecting the null hypothesis. In this case, the person was actually guilty. We should have declared the person as guilty, but we did not do that. This is called type 2 error and represented by the Greek symbol beta. Now, the typical value of alpha in most of the tools and packages is 5% or 0.05, and the typical value of beta is 10% or 0.10. Notice these are the maximum limits which are tolerable. We are saying we may go wrong while making judgments. It could be such a case where a not guilty person is framed so well that the judge can't help, has to go by the evidence and declare the person to be guilty. But that error should not exceed 5% is what we are saying. Similarly, for beta, we are saying it should not exceed 10%. Now, you might argue why we have a higher tolerance towards beta compared to alpha. That's a general case, and that's based on a principle. We'll talk about that very soon. These are the standard references that are typically followed. But on a case-to-case basis, we may want to believe that we want to have lower tolerances towards these errors. So for example, an alpha could also be 0.01 or 0.001, depending on whether it's a life or death scenario for somebody. Now, why we have a lower tolerance towards alpha and higher tolerance towards beta? That's based on the principle of jurisprudence, which states that even if 100 culprits are to be released or let go free, no innocent person should be penalized or put behind the bars. So alpha is a more expensive error in general sense. Now let's look at some more terms related to this. And a very important term when you talk about hypothesis testing is the confidence level. 1 minus alpha is the confidence level. Alpha is the chance of making an error. So 1 minus alpha is the chance of making the right decision. We want to have at least 95% confidence when we are performing a hypothesis test. In most of the cases, if alpha is 0.05 or 5%, the confidence level would be 95%. So we are saying that out of 100 opportunities, 95 times we will end up making the right decisions, at least. Similarly, 1 minus beta is known as the power of test. It is used in determining the right sample size. So the whole idea of making assumption here is coming from the fact that we are mostly studying samples. And if we have not studied the entire population, we probably are making some assumptions. Alpha and beta essentially put a control on how much error you're allowed to make. You should keep it as low as possible, but there is an upper limit that's set with the help of alpha and beta. Now comes another term that's known as p-value. So alpha is your standard, but p-value is something that you calculate for your actual data. It's like when you work in an organization, you have certain performance targets that are given to you. But against that, what you achieve is your actual achievement. Just like that, alpha here is the maximum permissible error. We are clearly given a mandate to be below this level of 5%. P-value, however, estimates where you actually are. If we are making an error which is less than alpha, then we may be allowed to reject the null hypothesis because that 5% was the buffer given. But if we make an error that exceeds 5%, we may not be allowed to reject the null hypothesis in that case. What is p-value? P-value in simple terms is the calculated probability of making a type 1 error. This is the actual outcome based on your data, whereas alpha was a standard. If p-value is less than alpha, we reject null hypothesis. If p-value is greater than alpha, we fail to reject the null hypothesis. Let's understand this visually. What does it mean? So we are taking an example where this dashed red line and the region to the right of it entirely represents the alpha of 5%. This is 5% area under the curve. And these blue shaded lines that you see is the region bound by the p-value. Remember, the type 1 error is incorrectly rejecting the null hypothesis. In this case, what do we observe? Alpha is a bigger value compared to the shaded region in blue. So this is a case of p-value less than alpha. If that is the case, we are allowed to reject the null hypothesis. But the case on the right is different. The region to the right of this red line is less compared to this blue shaded region. This blue shaded region represents the p-value. So in this case, we'll say p-value is greater than alpha. And if this is the case, we will not be allowed to reject the null hypothesis. P is less than alpha, it is okay to reject the null hypothesis. When P is greater than alpha, we should not be rejecting the null hypothesis. A simple way to remember this would be when P is low, null will go or gets rejected. And when P is high, null will fly or it wins. Essentially, we do not reject it. This is just a shortcut to remember this entire piece. Now let's move to the idea of one-tailed and two-tailed tests. So there are two types of one-tailed tests. First is a left-tailed test. Opposite is the right-tailed test. And the third possibility is that you equally divide alpha and allocate it to both the tails. In this case, the entire alpha risk is placed on one tail, that is particularly the left tail. That's why it's called a left-tailed test. On the other hand, this case, entire alpha value is placed on the right tail, and that's why it's called a right-tailed test. But in this case, we equally divide alpha into two parts, and that's why it's called a two-tailed test. So how do you figure out what type of tail test you're performing? That's something which we'll understand with the help of an example. So let's say you buy a pack of breakfast cereals, and it's a pretty standard product produced by a reputed company. If the packet says the content inside are weighing 100 grams, you typically tend to believe that. But once you bring that packet home and you realize that it has lesser content, you'll probably have a problem. How would you have a problem? You'll challenge the status quo. Status quo was that the company has been selling this product for a while now, so we believe what they're talking about. The prevalent belief is that the contents are as specified. But in your case, if you experience something less than what's written on the packet, then you're going to challenge it. You have the data. You must have measured the contents, and you're saying it's less than 100 grams. Now, this is a left tail test because you have a less than sign here. The null hypothesis here would be it's greater than or equal to 100 grams. The company might give a little bit extra, but not less than what they publicize. So if you see null and alternate kind of complement each other. Please note null will always be checked on equality. So when you're claiming for less, it has to check it on equality. You can write it with just an equal to sign or a greater than or equal to sign, completely complementing the alternate hypothesis. On the other hand, the company might challenge that, you know what, we are a standard organization and we never undersupply. We give you a little bit extra. So they can challenge it saying that weight is greater than 100 grams. And in this case, it will be a right tail test because they are using a greater than sign. What will be the null hypothesis here? It will be the complement of this. So that will be less than or equal to. But you'll be checking it for equal to only. And if you do not claim whether it's less or more, but you say that the packaging is somewhat inconsistent. At times you give more, at times you give less, so I cannot trust you. In that case, you did not give a direction, either less or greater. All you're saying is that it is not equal to 100 grams. And in this case, the null hypothesis would be just a simple equal to sign, whereas the alternate hypothesis would be a not equal to sign. So if you see in this particular video, we learn some important concepts. First is, why is it that we need hypothesis testing? You have a real world data, you have assumptions about it, but you want to validate that with the help of data. That's where you need hypothesis. We looked at a step-by-step process to conduct hypothesis testing, which will be emphasized in the subsequent video. Then we talked about all the essential terms, like what is a hypothesis, what is a null hypothesis, what is an alternate hypothesis. We looked at these with the help of some examples. We looked at what is a type 1 error, what is a type 2 error, what is a confidence level, what is a power, and then what is a p-value. And comparing p-value and alpha, how do we make our decisions? And finally, we looked at different types of tests, left tail test, right tail test, or two-tail test, depending on the alternate hypothesis. This much theoretical background is needed for you to be able to understand the subsequent videos on hypothesis testing.